Okay, so what actually is Pokémon? Pokémon is the best-selling media franchise on planet Earth. It's made its way into essentially every form it could, every corner of the world, and certainly into the heart of myself at a very young age. I've been a Pokémon fan since I was a child. My name is TheJarvitar, and this video is meant to act as a general introduction to those that are totally new to Pokémon as a hobby. It's my hope that this can be an ongoing series, a long-term project that can act as a guide to all things Pocket Monsters. This video will act as a general intro to the Pokémon video games, but I plan on making videos that cover every aspect of the franchise in varying levels of depth. To be here when those come out, be sure to subscribe to the channel. And if this video ends up being good, be sure to leave a like and let me know that I'm onto something here. My history with Pokemon starts years ago. At the age of 5 or 6, my oldest brother lent me his Game Boy Color while on a family trip to a local museum. After noticing how enraptured I was while playing his copy of Pokemon Yellow, he and my other older brother gave me the most impactful Christmas present of my life: a Game Boy Pocket and a copy of Pokemon Red version. From that moment, I've come a long way, but still my love for this series has never diminished. And now I talk about it on the internet. So please get comfy, kick back, and let me introduce you to my favorite thing. In order to do just that, I feel like it's probably a good idea to change into something more appropriate. I'll be right back. There we go. Professor TheJarvitar is here to introduce you to the wide world of Pokemon. When looking for a good place to start in regards to Pokemon's history, I think a good one is the early 90s, where founder of Pokemon game designer Satoshi Tajiri began work on a monster collecting video game that took heavy inspiration from his own childhood observing insects in his hometown. Tajiri worked closely with artist Ken Sugimori, producer Junichi Masuda, and a small team of other developers at their own game development company called Game Freak. The game that they wished to make was intended to make full use out of the Nintendo Game Boy's link cable functionality. The game relied on a core gimmick of catching monsters in small capsules, just like the one that you'll see at the grocery store. This gimmick inspired the original name of the series, Capsule Monsters, shortened to Capumon. But unfortunately, due to copyright issues, the name was changed soon after to Pocket Monsters, shortened now to the household name Pokémon. From 1990 until 1996, this small team at Game Freak worked on Pokemon on and off. The project, which originally was much smaller in scope, ended up being much more difficult than was originally thought. The final product was released on February 27, 1996 as two different games, Pokemon Red version and Pokemon Green version. The two games differed slightly in available Pokemon to encounter, which was done to promote the use of the Game Boy's link cable to trade Pokemon between versions. And from there, it's history. After becoming a sleeper hit in Japan despite a lack of insane marketing, Red and Green would get a third improved version called Blue. And the third version would be the basis on which the international versions of Pokemon would be made. Here in the United States, for example, we received Pokemon Red and Blue version on September 28, 1998. By the time those international copies were made available, the Pokemon media franchise was ready to flood the market with promotional material and other things. Anime, trading cards, merchandise, Pokemon was everywhere. And since then, Pokemon has cemented itself as the #1 most lucrative media franchise on the planet. Now that I've given you an incredibly brief history of the initial development of these games, I'd like to spend the rest of the video going over those games and the ones that came after in greater detail. The video games that Pokemon has made are the foundation on which the entire franchise is based, the cornerstone of the brand, and easily the most important in regards to the identity of the series. When discussing Pokemon video games, there are two major groups in which they can be placed. Those are the main series games and the spin-off games. Now, the core gameplay of Pokemon games comes down to three major things: collecting Pokemon, battling, and then trading. Each major release, still to this day, maintains these three mechanics as essential to their gameplay loop. The most impactful and novel aspect of Pokemon in general is catching these little guys, training them up so they evolve into stronger Pokemon, battling against other teams, and then also trading your Pokemon with your friends. One of the great aspects of the Pokemon hobby is the general organization of its content. You see, Pokemon is broken down into specific generations. A Pokemon generation begins when two games are released simultaneously, just like Red and Green were, with a new batch of Pokemon to catch and train. As of the filming of this video, we have had 9 generations of Pokemon games. Each generation is made up of the benchmark titles that started them, and then some enhanced version or spin-off that comes out before the next major release. But as a general note going forward, as I talk about Pokemon generations, I'll be using American release dates and titles in an effort to stay consistent. Pokemon Red and Blue act as the beginning of the first generation of Pokemon. In these games, the player explores the Kanto region, based on the real-life Kanto region of Japan, and you, the player, set out on your very own Pokemon journey to catch every one of the available 150 Pokemon. The most iconic Pokemon of all time can be found in this original batch. Nowadays, names like Pikachu, Charizard, Venusaur, and Big Man Blastoise are known worldwide. In Red and Blue, you can battle your way through 8 gyms in order to reach the Pokemon League, and also end up taking down an organized crime syndicate in Team Rocket. Not too long after their release, we were treated to a third version that was directly inspired by the events of the also wildly popular Pokemon anime in Yellow version. But these Game Boy titles weren't the only games to get lumped into Generation 1. Nintendo 64 home console games like Pokémon Stadium and Snap also count, and other titles like the Game Boy version of the trading card pocket game, or Pokemon Puzzle League, or Pokemon Pinball, all of those count too. As you can see, it didn't take long for Nintendo to really capitalize on what was an insanely hot property. Each generation of the Pokemon games has held to a similar formula as it did Gen 1, with the new generation starting with 2 games acting as counterparts in which new Pokemon are introduced, and the player takes part in exploring a region filled with characters in a turn-based RPG setting. Then, after that initial release, enhanced versions, or in the modern day DLC, gets released, as well as spin-offs and all other things. After the first generation started with Red and Blue, the second came out in the year 2000 with Gold and Silver. These games were meant to be direct sequels of Red and Blue. This time, the player explores the area to the west of the Kanto region, known as Johto. 100 more Pokemon are made available for you to catch and train, and some of the most notable additions made in Gen 2 were new evolutions of old Pokemon like Crobat, Umbreon, and Espeon. Not to mention the greatest Pokemon ever made, Tyranitar. 8 more gyms are there for you to fight your way through, and once again Team Rocket has insane plans that you need to thwart. Notable other games as part of Gen 2 are the enhanced version, Crystal, which adds new story details not present in Gold and Silver, and then Pokemon Stadium 2 for the N64 and Puzzle Challenge. The third generation of Pokemon games came to Game Boy Advance systems on March 19, 2003, with Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire version. The Hoenn region, based on the Japanese island of Kyushu, acts as the setting for our adventure this time. Ruby and Sapphire bring our Pokemon total up to 386. Pokemon you may have heard of from this batch may be Gardevoir, Mudkip, or Rayquaza. The wildly popular enhanced version of Ruby and Sapphire Emerald has Rayquaza as its box legendary. The third generation is famous not only for its updated graphics, incredible soundtrack, and hefty supply of water, it's also where Pokemon battles were first introduced to the double battle format, which is to this day the most popular competitive format for battles in general. Equally as impactful as the Hoenn games from Gen 3 were the remakes of the Gen 1 games that came out for the Game Boy Advance with Fire Red and Leaf Green. The player is back in Kanto with this faithful remake of the original titles, but with expanded content and quality of life changes that came as part of the new generation. Fire Red and Leaf Green are important as they begin the trend of Pokemon making remakes for their original main series games to accompany the core releases in certain generations. And quick aside, Fire Red and Leaf Green are probably my favorite Pokemon games of all time. It's hard to say that definitively because of how much I love this series, but these games are endlessly replayable for me, and I do at least one playthrough of this game like every 8 months or so. Now, the most important spin-offs that I may touch on throughout all of this video came as part of Gen 3. Pokemon Colosseum and XD Gale of Darkness were full-on Pokemon RPGs made for the Nintendo GameCube. The main difference is that in these titles, rather than catching wild Pokemon, you actually steal Pokemon from evil trainers. These games are nowadays widely loved, and expensive if you want to get an original copy. The fourth generation of Pokemon began on April 22, 2007, with Diamond and Pearl on the Nintendo DS. In Diamond and Pearl, the player is put in the endlessly iconic Sinnoh region, based on the northern Japanese island of Hokkaido. Again, the player gets to make their way through 8 gyms and become the league champion. And at this point, the Pokemon total is up to 493. The Pokédex of Gen 4 was interesting though, in that a significant portion of the Pokemon introduced were new evolutions of old Pokemon introduced in older games. Magmortar for Magmar, Dusknoir for Dusclops, and Yanmega for Yanma are all examples. As far as the current fandom is concerned, Diamond and Pearl, and especially the enhanced version Platinum, are some of the most iconic games of all time. Garchomp and Lucario came out as part of Gen 4 and have cemented themselves as immensely popular Pokemon. Gen 4 is also famous for its human NPCs, especially the champion of the Sinnoh Pokemon League, Cynthia, who has since become what I believe is easily the most popular human character in all of the Pokemon games, save for maybe the player character from Gen 1. Alongside Diamond and Pearl were also the incredible Gen 2 remakes Heart Gold and Soul Silver. These games are famous for being considered nowadays the best Pokemon games of all time by many. As subjective as that title may be, you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone who doesn't at least consider these games as in the running. Seriously, you can type in why Heart Gold and Soul Silver are the best Pokemon games, and you'll be met with hundreds of videos going over this exact subject. Major spin-offs that come to mind from that time are Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time and Darkness, the Pokemon Ranger games, Battle Revolution for the Wii, and a whole bunch of others. Gen 4 acts as a very interesting period in the history of Pokemon games. From the perspective of a modern Pokemon fan, when someone refers to the old Pokemon games, usually these 4 generations are essentially what they're talking about. These 4 generations are aggressively similar in general design and iterate off of each other. This can be seen in the Pokemon introduced, with the staggering amount of new evolutions that get introduced for each other here. It's in Generation 5, with Black and White, that we see some massive deviations away from what was a tried and true formula for the first several years of the franchise. Major criticism at the time usually centered around Pokemon games having stories that lacked depth. With Gen 5, we were given a narrative that was much more prevalent in the story and had much more significant characters. Alongside this, they wanted to go for a soft reboot with the series. So in the base game of Black and White, before beating the game, you could only encounter Pokemon that were introduced in Gen 5. As part of this design decision, we were given the single biggest batch of new Pokemon we've ever had, with 156 of them, bringing our total up to 649. With all these changes to the formula that had long been desired for the series, how were Black and White received upon arrival? They were hated. Folks today might not remember because Black and White are kind of looked back pretty nostalgically, but the Pokemon community absolutely dunked on Black and White when they first came out. The story was considered overly intrusive and melodramatic initially, and the new Pokemon introduced were absolutely reamed. If you've heard Pokemon talk about the ice cream Pokemon or the trash bag Pokemon, it's from this generation. Though for as many unpopular designs as there were in these games, there's also Pokemon like Haxorus, Excadrill, and Crocodile, which are definitely loved today. The setting of Black and White is the Unova region, based on New York. Here we see for the first time that a main series region is based on an area outside of Japan, which is also emblematic of the game's commitment of being different from the rest of the franchise. Like I said, nowadays Gen 5 is beloved by a significant portion of Pokemon fans, especially amongst my age group. A consistent trend that you'll notice going forward is that most people's favorite Pokemon games usually end up being the ones they play at the age of 10. As part of Gen 5, we didn't end up getting a remake, nor did we get an enhanced version like Pokemon Gray, like most folks assumed. Instead, we got direct sequels to Black and White with Black 2 and White 2. People were really confused at the time of release as to what to even do with these titles. Black and White were not very popular amongst longtime fans, so these titles essentially got swept under the rug. They didn't really sell that well. Black 2 and White 2 are some of the worst selling main series Pokemon games of all time. Which is crazy, because they're also some of the best. Black 2 and White 2 are some of the most content-rich Pokemon games ever. If you've been a longtime fan of the series, you should absolutely play these games. Getting a physical copy can be harder than you think though, because these original cartridges are way expensive. Now Gen 6 is where we start to see some really big changes going forward. Gone are the 2D sprites that have long been the standard of the main series Pokemon games for the last ever. And with the Pokemon series move to the 3DS came Pokemon X and Y in 2013. This release was actually the first one ever to get a simultaneous launch worldwide. So from here on out, when I bring up release dates, they're actually going to be legit. X and Y were weird. The build up to these games was unlike any other really, though that may be because I was aggressively present for the X and Y hype train. 13-year-old TheJarvitar was on forums and checking the news for these games every single day. Every leak was read, every YouTube video was watched. But back to the final product, X and Y. Besides being famous for being in 3D, these games are known for several things. First off, they're known for being incredibly easy. And gone was the hyper-focus on story that was present in Gen 5, where Black and White went out of their way to distance themselves from earlier gens in an effort to go for a soft reboot. X and Y wanted to dig up as much nostalgia for those earlier games as possible. To the point that they literally give you a free Gen 1 starter like 45 minutes into your new game. The new mechanic that really shows this desire to tug on your childhood is Mega Evolution. Mega Evolution is the first in a series of regional battle gimmicks that has been present in every Pokemon game since Gen 6. Mega Evolution allows you to further evolve one of your Pokemon once per battle into a Mega form that is phenomenally strong. Several Mega Evolutions were made, and nearly every aspect of X and Y was intrinsically tied to the application of this new mechanic. In X and Y, you're placed in the Kalos region, based on France, and once again fighting your way through 8 gyms and evil organization and making your way to the Pokemon League. All while encountering and hopefully catching the smallest individual batch of new Pokemon ever. Likely due to the introduction of Mega Evolution, X and Y only introduced 72 Pokemon, less than half as much as the previous gen. But standouts from this have become some of the most popular Pokemon of all time. Greninja, while I'm personally not a huge fan, is really popular. Folks love this Ninja Frog. Other bangers from this gen are Noivern, Florges, Talonflame, and Tyrantrum. Like, really the list goes on here. X and Y nowadays are entering the era of their lives where they're becoming vintage, so some folks are looking back on them fondly. But at the time, and for a while now, most folks did not like these games. Now, Gen 6 did also give us some remakes. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire are essentially just as beloved as X and Y are hated. These games really ran with the idea of iterating on what was present in the Gen 3 titles. Tons of new features, and especially the application of X and Y's Mega Evolution, made these games very popular on release. Now, one thing that you will notice from Gen 6 is a distinct lack of any enhanced version of X and Y. Every other generation has some sort of expansion after the release of the main games. That has come in the form of a third game in older titles, sequels in Black and White, DLC in modern games, but X and Y, they got the short end of the stick. Now, Gen 6 was also the generation that introduced probably the most important spin-off game in all of Pokemon's history, Pokémon Go. I'm sure the bulk of you all know about Pokémon Go. You walk around the real world, catch Pokemon, battle gyms, and have a grand old time walking through other people's yards. It's a good game. Now let's talk about Gen 7, with Sun and Moon dropping in late 2016. These games take the player to the Alola region, based on Hawaii. Now, if there's anything that you can take from the online discourse regarding these games, it is cutscenes. There's so many cutscenes in these games, which can be alright if you're into the story here, but the lack of player freedom for a lot of folks, they weren't stoked. The other most important aspect of Sun and Moon is the change from gym leaders to trial captains and kahunas. This change, while honestly not that monumental in the moment, was a pretty good shakeup. Now, alongside that change was another battle gimmick in the same vein as Mega Evolution. Z-moves are essentially the ability to use one really massive nuclear move once per battle. With Z-moves came really cool animations and a good amount of cheese in battle. The mechanic was cool at the time, but it's definitely not as beloved nowadays as Mega Evolution is. The Pokemon introduced in Sun and Moon also came in a slightly bigger batch. By the end of Gen 7, we had 809 Pokemon to battle and capture. Some of the standouts from this gen were Rowlet, Mimikyu, and Incineroar. The most enduring new feature added as part of Sun and Moon were the regional variants of Pokemon. This mechanic reintroduced old Pokemon with new appearances and types. A mechanic like this was an instant hit with fans of the series, not only because it brought new spotlight to beloved Pokemon, but because it makes sense. Pokemon from different parts of the world will be slightly different. Rather than getting an expanded third version to Sun and Moon, we actually got two of them, Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. They weren't sequels like Black 2 and White 2, and as far as expanded games are considered, these are pretty good. Major story changes and new mechanics abound. Most folks believe that the Ultra games are the best way to experience Alola. The other major release as part of Gen 7 came as a remake. Kinda. Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee essentially are remakes of the original Pokemon Yellow for the Game Boy Color. But now we've actually had a hardware upgrade heading to the Nintendo Switch. In these games, you're unable to battle wild Pokemon with your own, and instead can only catch them. These games were an attempt to harmonize certain Pokemon Go mechanics with the main series games. It worked alright, and many folks were excited to be back in Kanto, and my favorite aspect of these games is the inclusion of Pokemon that you can ride on, like Charizard and Arcanine. Heading over to Gen 8, we've got one of the most interesting generations of Pokemon really ever. There is so much that can be said about the games that came out around this time. It all starts with Sword and Shield back in 2019, and wow, these games came with a lot of baggage. Before any of that gets discussed, Sword and Shield put you, the player, in the Galar region, based on England with a new battle gimmick known as Dynamax, where your Pokemon get really big. Yeah, that's it, that's the thing. They get huge. It was definitely something. But more important than your Pokemon getting massive was the wild area. a large part of the region that was sectioned off as a semi-open world. This was the first time something like this had ever been done in a Pokemon game, and it was an exciting indicator of what was to come. Now, what were the problems that folks had with Sword and Shield? Well, here's the thing. We're on the Nintendo Switch at this point, and folks were playing these games on their TVs. No longer was Pokemon played on a tiny screen on an exclusively handheld device. And compared to other Switch titles like Zelda Breath of the Wild or Xenoblade, these games looked underbaked. The meme at the time really pointing out this lack of graphical quality was a tree found in the wild area. This tree served as a symbol to many that Pokemon just wasn't trying hard enough to deliver a quality experience. The other major problem folks had came from the available Pokédex in these games. For the first time ever in Pokemon's history, certain Pokemon were banned from entry into the new titles, having to remain in limbo in the Switch's storage system, Pokemon Home. Not having access to beloved old Pokemon pretty rightfully rubbed folks wrong. But I don't know, I still really like these games. Sword and Shield introduced an incredible batch of Pokemon, and when taking into account all the Pokemon from Gen 8 that we ended up with, we get a final total of 905. And I'm talking bangers. Urshifu, Dragapult, Toxtricity, like, come on, dude. Rather than a third version or even an extra game at all, here we got the first ever DLCs for a Pokemon game. Sword and Shield got the Isle of Armor and Crown Tundra DLCs that expanded the playable area and also brought more old Pokemon back into the game. I really like these DLCs, and with them as part of the game, Sword and Shield are some of the most content-rich Pokemon games that you can play. After Sword and Shield and its DLCs, we got one of the wildest reveals that the Pokemon community has ever had. At this point, we were all on the edge of our seats for Diamond and Pearl remakes. Sinnoh nostalgia was at an all-time high. And in early 2021, so much Sinnoh content was revealed. The first thing shown off was a faithful remake of Diamond and Pearl called Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. And then right after that reveal, we were shown Pokemon Legends Arceus, which was a brand new open world Pokemon game that put the player back in the Sinnoh region, but a century in the past. Players explored a world where Pokemon were feared and hostile. And the massive switch in the formula, plus a unique art style, a great story, and so many other things, combined to make this game considered one of the best Pokemon games of all time. If only the same could be said for Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. The chibi art style and lack of major alterations to the original games make Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl considered some of the worst Pokemon games of all time. You can see that at this time it was pretty wild to be a Pokemon fan. So many ups and downs for real. The community was on fire at this time. I recommend playing them for yourself and developing your own opinion. Legends Arceus specifically is home to some of my favorite Pokemon to come out of the last several generations, like Ursaluna and Kleavor. And now we are here with the current generation of Pokemon games. Generation 9 so far only has its main games out. Scarlet and Violet are the newest main series games to come out. In November of 2022, we got the first ever full-on open world Pokemon games. Legends Arceus was close, but it had separated hubs to explore. Scarlet and Violet have the massive Paldea region to explore, and while it is really cool and fun to go through, there's one problem. Remember when I mentioned that Sword and Shield were hated because of their visuals? Well, Scarlet and Violet do not make full use of the power of the Nintendo Switch either. As limited as it is, there's something wrong happening here. These games are buggy, for real. But don't let that take away from the fact that these games are really fun. Encountering Pokemon roaming the countryside has always been a personal dream for me, and seeing that brought to life in this game was incredible. The story also was very interesting how it stuck to a very character-focused and condensed narrative. I really enjoyed it. The main battle gimmick that we are given in Gen 9 is called Terastallization. This mechanic changes a Pokemon's type for the duration of the battle. And while the aesthetics of the mechanic aren't really my favorite, I actually love how dynamic it can make battles nowadays. Scarlet and Violet also got the DLC treatment as well, with 2 expansions, the Teal Mask and Indigo Disc. In both, you travel to a new land with more Pokemon available to encounter, and take part in a localized narrative that is fairly character-focused. Once again, with the additions of the DLCs, Scarlet and Violet are some really content-rich games. If only they looked and ran a lot better. I'm telling you, they could have been all-time hits. With that, we're brought to the present day. As of right now, the upcoming Pokemon game we're looking forward to is Pokemon Legends ZA. Any moment now, we're anticipating a full reveal for the game. The only thing that we know is that we're going back to Kalos, and it will be heavily tied to the Gen 6 titles. We also know that Mega Evolution will be returning. So there's a lot to be excited about in the near future of the Pokemon franchise. With that, thank you so much for sitting tight during this lecture. I hope you've come away from it with a general knowledge of the main series of the Pokemon games and are excited to learn more next time. There are so many topics to cover, so if you have a preference, let me know in the comment section below what you'd like to go over. There is so much to explore from the wide world of Pokemon, and it is my intention to be your guide through every nook and cranny. If a Pokemon video like this one was something you enjoyed, feel free to drop a like and subscribe for more. And with that, peace out, Pokemon trainers.